And here we have lesson 32 entitled Native American Policy. So our teaks that we can put the events surrounding Jackson's Native American policy in chronological order, that we can analyze the reasons for and the effects of the Indian Removal Act, Worcester v. Georgia Supreme Court case, and the Trail of Tears, that we can locate important regions of the U.S. related to these issues, and finally that we can identify ways that conflicts with people from different racial backgrounds were resolved. So we begin our lesson by talking about the 5 civilized tribes, and these were the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole Native American tribes, and they lived in what is now the southeastern United States, occupying what is now the states of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and parts of the Carolinas. And they called them the 5 civilized tribes because they had adopted in many ways European lifestyles, and their lifestyle and technology was somewhat more advanced. They practiced agriculture, they had permanent settlements, and in the case of the Cherokee, they actually had an established written language. So they were referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. Now, if we look at Cherokee settlement patterns today, we see that with a few exceptions here in the southeast and along the California coast, the vast majority of Cherokees live in the state of Oklahoma. And the question we're going to answer with this lesson is, why is that so? And I can give you a hint, it has nothing to do with them having Oklahoma Sooner seasons tickets. So let's move ahead and answer that question. So here we see our 2 natives talking, asking the question is, are they here legally? To which the other one replies, I guess we'll just have to wait until they write the laws. So we'll see what they mean by that comment in just a moment. Now, in Unit 6, we discussed the invention of the cotton gin and the great importance it had on the U.S. cotton production, turning it into the South's most valuable cash crop. And this chart here bears that out. In 1790, before the cotton gin, the U.S. was producing about 1.5 million pounds of cotton per year. But by 1860, that number has risen to nearly 2 billion pounds. And at this time, the U.S. is producing about 70% of the world's cotton. Now, in order to increase cotton production, that also meant an increased demand for cotton farming land. And on top of that, in 1829, gold was discovered in Georgia on part of what was then the Cherokee Nation. And this is going to lead to a conflict between the state of Georgia and the Cherokees who are living on that land. So let's see what happens. So we have the Indian Removal Act. In 1830, with the support of President Andrew Jackson, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which was a bill to force the Native Americans living to the east of the Mississippi to move to lands west of the Mississippi River. And here we see the text of that bill. And again, Andrew Jackson was a strong supporter of this, and in fact gave a speech to Congress in December in which he talked about the benefits of the Indian Removal Act and the need to move these natives off their land. So here we see a map that the state of Georgia began to take land from the Cherokees in order to provide it for their farmers. And here we see a map of some of the paths that the natives had to take in their relocation to what became the Indian Territories, which is now in the state of Oklahoma. All right, moving ahead. Prior to this, however, the United States had a treaty with the Cherokee Nation going back to 1791 and the presidency of George Washington. So the first part of this was a treaty of peace and friendship between the U.S. and the Cherokee Nation. That the U.S. recognized that they had the right to their lands and the U.S. would guarantee those rights. That any citizen of the United States would not be allowed to settle on Cherokee land, and the U.S. would not protect them from Cherokee law if they did. And finally, that they were not even allowed to go into Cherokee country without permission. Now you might say, why did the U.S. do this? Because George Washington had negotiated a treaty with the Cherokees going back to the Revolutionary War, in which they agreed to remain neutral in the U.S.'s fight with Britain. So this was sort of a payback for the Cherokee support of the U.S. during the Revolution. So we have a sovereign nation within a sovereign nation, the Cherokee within the United States. So the Indian Removal Act is essentially throwing away and disregarding this treaty and the Cherokees' right to their lands. So in response to the Indian Removal Act, the Cherokees bring the state of Georgia to court. And this is one of the last cases under Chief Justice John Marshall that we discussed about before, he of Marbury v. Madison. And the plaintiff in this case is a man named Samuel A. Worcester. Now, Worcester was a white missionary who lived among the Cherokee, and because natives had no standing to appear before the Supreme Court, Worcester represented them as the plaintiff in this case. And in this decision, the Supreme Court decided in favor of the Cherokees in the case Worcester v. Georgia, and that is our 4th major Supreme Court case that we need to learn. So again, The Supreme Court found that the Cherokees had a legal right to their land, entitled by this treaty and by previous law, and that the Indian Removal Act, the state of Georgia did not have the right to drive them off of their land and take their land from them. However, President Andrew Jackson, who had agreed with the Indian Removal Act, allowed Georgia to continue to take Cherokee land because he considered the natives to be a conquered people and that they were subject to state laws. So he disagreed with and disregarded the idea of the Cherokees having a sovereign nation inside the state of Georgia and the rights to their own territory. He said they were subject to the state law. In fact, his famous quote, or at least the one he's purported to have said, was, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." So my question to you is, if you remember what we learned about the principles of the Constitution, do you think the Constitution supports the President acting in this way, in which he has disregarded a Supreme Court decision because he disagrees with it? Think about that and discuss that. So in 1838, the Cherokees are forced at gunpoint by the U.S. Army, and they are marched from Georgia to reservations in Oklahoma. And in fact, this path here is the one that the Cherokees were taken. And notice that it's kind of high up here, goes farther north, and takes them up into the mountains. And that's going to be a real factor in this journey here. And notice this name right here, the Trail of Tears. We'll talk about what that means. Along the way on their march from Georgia to Oklahoma, thousands of Cherokees died. In fact, about a quarter of their numbers died on this trip, and it became known as the Trail of Tears. They started out with somewhere around 15,000 Cherokee, and somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 of them died along the way. The reasons for this was, first of all, they left later in the year than they had wanted to. They left in the fall, so they ended up traveling on this trip through the winter. They went up high into the mountains where it was very cold and the conditions were much harsher. They lacked adequate supplies. They didn't have enough food or clothing or adequate shelter, blankets, or medicine. Thousands died from starvation, disease, and exposure to cold. And it was especially hard on the very elderly and the young, so many children and many elderly people were among the casualties on this trip. And again, because of the harshness of this journey and so many natives died on it, it's now known as the Trail of Tears, and it's actually marked today as a historic landmark. Here we have a quote saying, "I fought through the war between the states and have seen many men shot, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." This was from a Georgia soldier who was along on the trip there, and as you see, they were guarded by the U.S. Army as they made this trip. So the Trail of Tears has become known as kind of one of the darkest and saddest events in American history. So for our Lesson 32 thoughts, I'd like you to read this quote here from Andrew Jackson, and this is in that speech that he gave to Congress about the Indian Removal Act in December 6, 1830. And after you read this quote, look at our questions here. 1. How does this quote from Jackson's speech to Congress on the Indian Removal Act help us understand his policies toward Native Americans? And number 2, how do you think Native American leaders of the time would respond to this statement? So take some time, read the quote, see what Jackson's talking about, and then answer these two questions. And our next lesson will be on Oregon, Texas, and war.